Do you notice anything
merry.
different? Yeah? Ho, ho, ho.
But in 2024, everything fell apart and the marriage quietly went down the drain. They split, went their separate ways, and the story seemed settled. Since then, we've heard Ruth's side. Her version shaped the narrative, filled the headlines, and defined how people viewed the breakup. Eamonn stayed silent. No interviews, no clarifications, no pushback. Until now. At 66, Eamonn Holmes is finally speaking up. And what he's saying changes the tone of everything. It reframes how the breakup looks and, more importantly, how Ruth Langsford comes across in the aftermath. So, what exactly did Eamonn Holmes say, and why did he wait this long to tell his side of the story? Join us as we get into all the details. Eamonn Holmes, the rise, the silence, and the side of the story you never heard. Long before the headlines, the breakups, and the carefully worded statements, Eamonn Holmes was just a Belfast schoolboy learning how to hold a room. He was educated at Holy Family Primary School, then St. at Malachi College and later the Dublin College of Business Studies. Nothing about that path screamed celebrity. What it did suggest was discipline, routine, and an early comfort with structure. And that would matter later, because Holmes built his entire career on being dependable when everything else was live, unpredictable, and often chaotic. His first real break came in 1979 when he walked into Ulster Television as a young presenter and reporter on Farming Ulster. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't national, but it was real broadcasting. It taught him how to think on his feet and how to speak to people without performing at them. From there, he slid naturally into sports coverage, working alongside seasoned reporters and learning the mechanics of live television the hard way through repetition and pressure. By 1982, Ulster Television trusted him enough to hand him the anchor's chair on Good Evening Ulster, their flagship news program. He was stepping into a role previously held by Gloria Hunter-Ford. And it was a quiet but significant vote of confidence. Holmes wasn't just reading scripts anymore. He was shaping conversations, setting the tone, and becoming a familiar face in Northern Irish homes. That he didn't limit himself to news. He hosted pageants, specials, and live events, proving he could move between serious and light without losing credibility. When he left Ulster Television in 1986 to join the BBC, it wasn't an escape, it was a promotion. In Manchester, he became part of Open Air and BBC One, broadcasting nationally and learning what it meant to speak to millions instead of thousands. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. In 1993, Holmes joined GMTV and helped launch its very first broadcast. Morning television is unforgiving. You're live, you're early, and you're expected to be sharp when the rest of the country is half awake. Holmes thrived there. He became part of people's routines, the voice that eased them into the day. Even when tensions surfaced behind the scenes, including a well-publicized falling out with Anthea Turner, he stayed put, grounded in the role. When he finally walked away from GMTV in 2005, he didn't do it quietly. He made it clear the show had drifted away from real news and leaned too heavily into celebrity fluff. That honesty followed him. 6 months later, Sky News brought him into Front Sunrise. And once again, Holmes settled into the rhythm of early mornings, rotating co-hosts, but keeping the tone steady and conversational. Along the way, he became one of television's most versatile presenters: snooker, darts, horse racing, tennis, quiz shows, panel shows, faith programs like Songs of Praise, game shows like Jeté. He didn't chase prestige. He chased consistency. Even when he joined This Morning in 2006, Holmes leaned into what he did best, making live television feel unscripted, but safe. That approach reached its peak when he began presenting alongside Ruth Langsford and Crean. They were easy, familiar, and believable. Together they fronted shows like Gift Wrapped and Ian and Ruth, How the Other Half Lives, turning their real-life partnership into a television brand. For viewers, it felt natural. For Holmes, it became inseparable from how the public saw him. But behind the scenes, the industry was changing. In 2020, Holmes lost a tribunal case over his freelance status under IR 35 rules. A moment that forced him to publicly defend not just his contract but his value. He described himself as one of the best live presenters in the country, and whether people agreed or not, the confidence was unmistakable. Radio had always been his other lane. From downtown radio in the late 80s to Radio 5 Live, Magic 105.4, Radio 2, and later talk radio. Holmes treated radio as a space where he could talk longer, dig deeper, and be less polished. It was where his opinions came through most clearly, and where audiences heard him without the filter of studio lights. By 2022, he had joined GB News, launching a breakfast show with Isabel Webster. Had described it as a place where he felt appreciated again, where journalism came first, and where rules could be bent just enough to make the conversation real. And now, after decades of being the steady one, the reliable one, the man who rarely explained himself, Holmes is talking again, not as a presenter reading headlines, but as a man finally stepping out from behind them. And once he does, the story doesn't move forward. It goes back to the part of his life that was always kept quiet long before the cameras, the commentary, and the need to explain anything at all. Eamonn and Ruth. The private love story that couldn't survive the spotlight. Eamonn and Ruth's love story didn't begin as a public romance or a television pairing designed for audiences to fall in love with. It began quietly, deliberately, almost cautiously at a time when both timing and restraint mattered more than excitement. When Eamonn Holmes met Ruth Langsford in 1997 through their mutual friend, Sally Mean, there was no rush to define what they were or announce it to the world. Holmes had separated from his first wife, Gabrielle, 2 years earlier, and the decision was made early to keep the relationship private, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. And that choice, made long before cameras followed their every move, quietly set the tone for everything that followed. When they did start dating, the relationship stayed firmly out of public view. Years later, Langsford would look back on that period and explain that Holmes' insistence on privacy only deepened her feelings for him. She reflected that it revealed the kind of man he was, the kind of father he meant to be, and the level of integrity he carried into his personal life. Far from making her feel hidden, it made her feel secure. 2 years passed before they finally went public, and by then, the relationship was already rooted in something solid. Life moved forward quickly after that. In 2002, they welcomed their son, Jack, a moment that quietly changed the center of their world. Langsford later revealed that she discovered she was pregnant just one day before her godson Charlie's christening. Holmes was away at the time, so she shared the news first with her best friend Sam, Charlie's mom. It was an intimate moment shared in confidence, one of those life events that doesn't need witnesses to feel profound. She would later describe it as a very special moment together, even in Holmes's absence. By 2006, their personal and professional lives began to fully intertwine. 9 years into their relationship, Holmes joined Langsford on the Friday edition of This Morning. Langsford was already established on the show, having been part of it since 1999. Quietly becoming its longest-serving presenter. Working side by side wasn't something they pretended was easy. Langsford openly acknowledged that working with your partner came with challenges, even as she admitted they managed it most of the time. As the years passed, they became one of daytime television's most recognizable partnerships. Together, they hosted Gift Wrapped, How the Other Half Lives, Losey a Stone in 4 Weeks, Eamonn and Ruth, S7, Year Itch and Do the Right Thing. Their chemistry became part of their public identity. The line between marriage and brand slowly blurring, Holmes leaned into it with humor, once joking that leaving television simply wasn't an option because viewers wouldn't stand for it. At the time, it sounded playful. In hindsight, it felt like a commitment that went deeper than either of them realized. 13 years after they first met and 5 years after Holmes's divorce from Gabrielle was finalized, they married at Elam Hall in Hampshire. Soon after, they bought a 6-bedroom house in Weybridge, Surrey, reportedly worth £3.2 million. It looked like the final piece clicking into place. Stability, success, permanence. Speaking years later on Strictly Come Dancing, Langsford described a marriage built on understanding. Holmes, she explained, was the first to tease her and just as quickly the first to surprise her with thoughtfulness. Even when she was consumed by the demands of the competition, she trusted that understood her completely. That, she believed, was why they worked. Then came 2020, and with it a shift neither of them seemed prepared for. In November, Holmes and Langsford were abruptly dropped from This Morning, replaced by Alison Hammond and Dermot O'Leary. The decision left them furious. Professionally, it was a blow; personally, it marked the beginning of a clear divide. Langsford remained with ITV, continuing her presence on Loose Women. Holmes moved in a different direction entirely, joining GB News to host a breakfast show. For the first time in years, their careers were no longer aligned and the distance between them was no longer just professional. By May 2024, the carefully maintained silence had finally broken. Holmes and Langsford confirmed that their marriage was over and that they were in the process of divorcing. A spokesperson explained that work commitments had taken their marriage in different directions. The message was calm, controlled, and carefully worded. They were determined to stay friends. They wanted to keep things amicable and an official statement was promised for their fans. But behind the carefully worded statement sat the end of a relationship that had once been built on patience, privacy, and shared purpose, and behind that ending sat something else, too. Something that had been wearing them down long before the marriage finally gave way. Because while the split was explained in calm language and professional terms, the truth is the pressure had already been building quietly inside the one place Eamonn Holmes couldn't outrun his own body. Eamonn Holmes. The pain that didn't end when the cameras cut. For years, the audience saw strength. What they didn't see was how much of that strength was borrowed. Behind the familiar voice and steady on-screen presence, Eamonn Holmes was fighting a body that was beginning to fail him piece by piece. But through it all, Ruth Langsford stood firmly at his side, offering support, reassurance, and optimism. But now, as their marriage comes to an end, and Holmes enters a new phase of life alone, those years' awfulness no longer feel like background noise. They feel like the pressure point where everything began to shift. Holmes has never hidden his health struggles. In fact, he spoke about them often, sometimes with humor, sometimes with brutal honesty. Long before the marriage unraveled, his body was already under siege. Years of acute pain eventually led to a double hip replacement in 2016. A 3-4 hour operation after he had lived with constant discomfort for far too long. At the time, he compared the experience to live television, admitting there were nerves in the build-up, but none once it began. He even described the surreal moment when people paid him emotional tributes the night before surgery. A moment that felt eerily like saying goodbye without actually going anywhere. When he woke up, seeing a smiling surgeon, his wife, and a lunch menu brought a strange sense of relief. He joked that it confirmed he must still be alive. That humor, that instinct to perform even through pain, became a recurring theme. Then came 2018. On what should have been a joyful family milestone, Holmes was struck down by shingles on the very day of his son Declan's wedding. The virus left his face swollen, marked, and unrecognizable. Years later, during an appearance on Loose Women, he shared images of the ordeal and spoke candidly about how brutal it was. He explained how shingles lies dormant in the body for most adults and can strike without warning. Looking at the photos on screen, he compared himself to Quasimodo, acknowledging just how shocking the condition had been. But it was 2021 that marked the beginning of his most devastating decline. That spring, completely out of nowhere, Holmes developed severe back pain.